Now it is my pleasure to hand you over to the woman of the day who will take us from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for your kind introduction, above and beyond. I really appreciate your comments. It's a delight that community relations in schools, the Corrymeela community, and Ulster University's International Conflict Research Institute, INCORE, have come together today as partners to co-host this book launch and panel discussion. It's this spirit of collaboration that I hope my book can encourage. And for this reason, it was important in launching the book to include both academics and practitioners into our panel. And actually, each of our panelists here today can be described as both. At this early opportunity, I'd also like to take a few minutes to publicly extend my thanks to several groups of people. Firstly, to all the practitioners I interviewed. The research upon which this book is based involved participation from 40 local peace practitioners whose activism represented a span of over 50 years. It was these rich and detailed interviews explaining early influences, pivotal life experiences, and peacebuilding successes and failures that without which the book would not exist. Secondly, I want to thank my 3 doctoral supervisors at Ulster University, where I studied from 2013 to 2018, Professor Duncan Morrow, Dr. Grania Kelly, and Professor Brandon Hamber, who joins our panel today. Their steady support offered inspiration, challenge, and guidance throughout the research process. I am one of those geeks who can honestly say I loved my PhD. This is due in no small part to the enjoyment I had working with this dream team. Thirdly, a huge thanks to my husband Hedley, my children Liam and Reese, my parents, and my extended family and friends who all supported the journey from PhD to book publishing. It had unexpected challenges, twists, and turns, but we got there. Finally, I'd like to thank Routledge Publishers and the Studies in Peace and Conflict Resolution series for believing in the research monograph. It's an honor to be included as part of this important series. Now, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the research upon which the book is based. This comes with the caveat that I can't hope to cover the entirety of 7 years of research and writing into the next 20 minutes, but I do hope to give you a taste of the research journey and the main themes that the book explores. In many respects, the research question is one that I have been interested in and have been exploring in my academic life and in my own peacebuilding practice over the last 30 years. I first came to Northern Ireland in 1992. I was 21, and it was in my 3rd year of a small Quaker college in the US studying for peace studies at the BA level. We had the chance to take a semester abroad to live and learn in areas of conflict. We had the choice of Jerusalem or Belfast. I chose Belfast. As I describe in the book, in Northern Ireland, despite an unmistakable war weariness left by, at that stage, 2 decades of the Troubles, I was intrigued to find a very active and vibrant civil society pushing forward to find some way, any way towards peace. I met practitioners who, despite real risks to their own safety, forged ahead in multiple ways to bring the violent political conflict to an end, addressing thorny issues arising from both the conflict's roots and its symptoms. That early experience planted a seed. I decided to return in 1994 and 1995 as a long-term volunteer for the Corrymeela community. It turned out to be a historic time to be here, coinciding with the time that the first ceasefires were announced and the framework document published. I continued to find ways to return to Northern Ireland for research and practice over the next several years. After finishing my master's in conflict transformation, I worked in the early 2000s on a peace education program in several schools that were situated across turbulent interface areas of North Belfast. Later, I became a consultant in community relations, trauma education, and in mediation, with a particular focus on young people and in schools. Over those years, I found myself trying to use my peace theories and to sharpen my technical skills in mediation and facilitation to improve my own practice. At times, my education, the theories and the skills served me well, but at other times, I could see that they were insufficient. Yet, when I observed the local peace builders all around me, there seemed to be a natural know-how that I could not replicate or even name. I watched and worked alongside local practitioners as they, for example, slowly built networks of trust across contentious interfaces, intervened and successfully managed high-stakes parading disputes, held quiet back-channel dialogue between local religious leaders and former and current combatants, or when little other statutory support existed, brought together victims of conflict for advocacy and trauma healing, just to name a few initiatives. As I watched these local civil society-based practitioners, I knew that despite my education at peacebuilding, my own knowledge and skills weren't enough. The truth of this became abundantly clear, especially when things did not go well. I begin the book telling the story of one epic failure when I was trying to mediate in a local high school in North Belfast. Excited to try my newly acquired toolkit of skills and theories, I charged ahead, setting up a face-to-face mediation between two disputing pupils. It was a disaster, and rather than sorting the issue, ended up escalating to the point where one of the students stood up, left the mediation, and marched straight out of the building and headed home. I repeat, my knowledge, theories, and skills weren't enough. But I didn't understand why. What was missing? I didn't know. This question niggled away at me until 2013, when I was fortunate to be offered a scholarship to study for my PhD at Ulster University. My aim was to better understand what had been learned from experience-driven practice of civil society peacebuilding over a span of 50 years. Interestingly, according to the academic literature, there was a predominant view that civil society had not made a significant contribution to the political peace. Some suggested that, for example, the community and voluntary sector acted merely as stretcher bearers, dealing with the aftermath of acts of violence. And others suggested that pro-peace activists simply supplied mood music in the lead up to political negotiations. An exception is the scholarship of Dr. Avila Kilmurray, one of our panelists here. Her recent book, published in 2017, Community Action in a Contested Society, The Story of Northern Ireland, is one of the few that describes the history of community activism for peace as determined, nuanced, and multifaceted. The prevailing view that civil society peacebuilding was insignificant came as a surprise. It contrasted with my own experience. In addition, it also surprised me that given the significant financial investment made over the last 25 years, there had not been more effort made to draw learning from practice. For example, the BBC recently reported that it is estimated that the EU, through its special program for peace and reconciliation, Peace 1 through 4, will have provided over €3 billion, equivalent to £2.5 billion and $3.5 billion. This financial investment also is reflected in a growth of activity. The Charity Commission for Northern Ireland reports there are now 447 charities who describe their purpose as linked to conflict resolution, reconciliation, and peacebuilding. Given this significant activity and financial investment, there is a surprising lack of theoretical investigation as to what has been learnt from practitioners as a result of their years of effort, particularly when it is important and increasingly understood in the field that such knowledge is important, and views from experts such as John Paul Lederach have advocated since the 1990s that integrated peacebuilding required peace processes to involve all levels of society. My research began in 2013, and after mapping the broader field, I explored 13 different types of local practice. It was important to gain wide representation of practitioners who spanned rural and urban geographies, gender, community background, types of activity, and years involved in peacebuilding. Eager to listen to their stories of practice, I took a qualitative approach and conducted one-to-one interviews during 2014 and 2015. This was a particularly interesting time as it directly followed the community unrest linked to what is known locally as the Flags protest, and it just preceded the collapse of the power-sharing government in early 2017. For the sake of time, I won't go into more details of methodology at this stage, but I'm happy to be contacted directly if there are those of you who are interested. I asked my interviewees to share how they learned to do peacebuilding, what had influenced them, and to tell me their stories of practice, successes and failures, and what had been learnt from their experiences. These stories provided a rich level of detail that surpassed my expectations. Their stories of practice revealed how local practitioners, for example, knew how to navigate microdynamics, such as the timing and pacing of negotiations between loyal order members and local residents involved in parading disputes, knew how to encourage and increase buy-in during sensitive dialogue processes held between senior Republicans and police to aid a gradual acceptance of justice reforms, knew how to use local knowledge and new technologies to innovate. For example, in the mid-1990s, when new mobile phone networks were used to create safe communication channels, dispelling rumors which had in the past fueled local conflict. And even by figuring out how to build popular support amongst fans in order to eliminate years of sectarian chanting during local football matches, just to name but a few. Rich practice stories also revealed what was to become a key finding in the research. During interviews and later during the research analysis, what became the most significant finding was the nature of how practice judgments were made and how practitioners knew what to do. Judgments were not predominantly based on theories or skills, but on a different form of knowledge. It was based on their own lived experiences of conflict and from navigating unpredictable, complex, and nuanced contexts. This form of knowledge was gained by improvising, learning on the job, listening to gut instincts, and informed by an understanding of their own embeddedness in their local community and local relationships. Peacebuilding decisions included an awareness of a sense of timing and pacing and deep understanding of a particular localized history, fault lines, and the worldviews held by all parties. To use academic language, the empirical research evidence revealed an epistemology of practice. In research, the function of theory is to provide a conceptual frame to help explain and interpret, to create a richer understanding of the world and empirical findings. As this research unfolded, a theoretical framework began to emerge to explain this epistemology of practice. What was exciting to me was that it also answered many of my research questions concerning why practice knowledge was under-theorized and how, despite the quantity of activity over years, civil society's role might be viewed as muted. I was led to a rediscovery not only of different kinds of knowledge, but of wisdom, practical wisdom, or in the Greek, Phenesis. In Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle discusses 3 forms of knowledge. Episteme. Episteme is what we might describe as scientific knowledge or theory-based knowledge. Techne. Techne is craft or skill-based knowledge. And phronesis. Phronesis is practical knowledge or practical wisdom. This is described as knowledge necessary for action. You will recognize that the first 2 forms of knowledge, episteme and techne, have modern derivatives, such as epistemology, the study of knowledge, and techne, technology, technique. Phronesis has no derivation. It has been lost to our modern lexicon. However, it is knowledge built upon experience and understanding of what is the right thing to do for action in a particular situation. And it requires knowledge of and also gained from an understanding of that particular context. Phenesis is a form of knowledge necessary for action and is formed by a deep understanding of local context and lived experience. Aristotle describes it as knowledge which is necessary for knowing how to live a good life, for human flourishing. In Greek, the word is eudaimonia. He describes it as a form of knowledge needed not only for individuals, but for society. And I'm going to quote Aristotle directly here, with sorts of things conduce to the good life in general. According to Aristotle, episteme, techne, and phronesis are all virtues of knowledge. However, phronesis may be most important, as it is required to understand when to use the other two. Applying phronesis to the research was illuminating. As a conceptual lens, it allowed me to see the data in a new way. For example, in chapter 4 of the book, using the lens of phronesis, I created a typology which examined 6 phases of local peace building, describing how practitioners used phronesis to navigate conflict terrain as it shifted over 50 years. In the following chapters, chapters 5 and 6, the interviews evidence how phronesis was employed and used to develop know-how through improvising, experimenting, and learning on the job. This, in turn, demonstrated knowledge of 5 different patterns in what might be described as local context knowledge. Interview evidence presented in these chapters also demonstrated adept tactical judgment about how to navigate a deeply distrustful and divided society. Under analysis, this revealed 4 different types of trust-building practices, which each helped establish the credibility and trustworthiness necessary to lever social change. Using the lens of phronesis as I conceptualized it in the book, the final chapters, 7 and 8, discuss the innovation, relevancy, and wisdom evidenced amongst this local body of practice. The book concludes by linking the concept of phronesis within the broader literature and the practices of peacebuilding. As I say in my concluding chapters, I hope that by conceptualizing phronesis, it can amplify and strengthen the continued move to valuing local peacebuilding. I hope that it also helps strengthen the voice of local practitioners here in Northern Ireland so that they are viewed, and importantly, view themselves as knowledge producers. Finally, as peacebuilding becomes increasingly professionalized, there is a danger of techne dominating the field, and many of my interviewees articulated this was increasingly a concern. Some felt that funding administration involved overly bureaucratic processes, which diverted resources and at times relevancy. The same concern is well articulated in the critical peace scholarship, that a professionalized peacebuilding becomes subsumed by a dominant technocratic peace, to borrow a term Professor Roger McGinty has used. If I can return 20 years ago now to the story of my epic failure for a moment, as I watched the student march out of the school, well, what do I now understand? I had episteme, I had techne. I now know that what I was missing was phronesis. It's my hope that in a small way, this book may help us to ask the question, how can we create an environment where episteme, techne, and phronesis can each flourish? As each are necessary forms of knowledge and wisdom, both valid and valuable for building long-term sustainable peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was absolutely fantastic. Much, much appreciated. I'm sure now you can take a small breath after sharing all that information. Good afternoon to all of you who are out there today joining us. here on this lovely afternoon. I know for some of you it's breakfast time, for some of you it's tea time, and we're just glad that you're with us and hope that you enjoy that experience. It's an absolute pleasure to be invited to chair this panel today, and I and Corrymeela would like to congratulate Emily on the launch of her book. It's very exciting. We've heard a very detailed presentation bringing to light the learnings from her research, and we're delighted that Dr. Martin McMullen, Dr. Avila Murray and Professor Brandon Hamber are able to join us to respond to what we've heard. We plan to give each of our panellists 3 to 5 minutes to respond to Emily's input, and I'll give them a wee nod if they get past 10 and we'll rein them back in again. And Emily will have the chance to respond after all 3 of those have spoken. We hope this will provide the landscape for discussion in the panel, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Folks, I'd really appreciate it if you want to put your questions into the chat function. We're keeping an eye on that, and hopefully we can bring those to the dialogue towards the end. So it is an absolute pleasure, as I say, to welcome our panel. And we turn first to Dr. Martin McMullen. Martin's a manager and practitioner and researcher in his role as Assistant Director in Youth Action Northern Ireland. He completed his PhD at the University of Southampton, focusing on separation and sectarianism in Northern Ireland. And Martin has made a really significant contribution to youth work and continues to build networks of peace activists in order to help increase reflective practice across the island. So Martin, we would be so grateful, you're very welcome today, and we'd be so grateful if you would be able to respond to what you've heard of Emily's presentation so far today.
Thanks very much, Shona, and welcome to everybody. Absolute congratulations to Dr. Emily Stanton on superb presentation, Emily, and really looking forward to getting tucked in to your book as well. So happy International Day of Peace, as we say, and also happy Good Relations Week to everybody. And I'm delighted that from a youth work perspective, that Community Relations Council this year have focused on young people in terms of brighter days ahead. So it's really refreshing, and thanks to Community Relations Council. So I suppose my first response really, Emily, I'm again throwing out there that your question about how do we listen and learn from peace building, and it really resonates with me in the sense of how do we encourage those involved in this really, really hard work, really complex work, to really express and tell their story in the first instance. How do we actually find the space and the time for those that are scurrying away, getting on with the really hard work in local communities, to actually stop and pause and reflect and think about how do they best share their story. The second part of that then makes me think about actually, once people have created their story or are telling their story, who are they telling it to? And are we creating spaces and places for people to listen? Do we set aside that time to listen, and how do we listen? And who are we listening to? And I suppose the question is, are we in the same sort of echo chambers and information bubbles or whatever we call it consistently, or how do we find new people that we are speaking to, particularly those who are emerging in our sectors, whether community or youth work? How do we inspire them and get that hook? A question I have just generally is around about how do we learn, what does that mean as well, from our practice? How do we best share learning? Certainly in my experience, both as a practitioner, manager, and even researcher, there have been a lot of really innovative, exciting developments through youth work over the years of conferences and seminars and critical thinking and critical youth research. That dips at times, it kind of ebbs and flows, but I'll come back to that as well. I think, Emily, for me, really what I heard from you today and what I know from your book is about that commitment of an active and vibrant civil society, has made a huge commitment to peace building. It's certainly been very extensive in the youth work sector from the 1970s, and part of that's been documented in Ulster University's Investing in Lives, the Story of Youth Work report by Matt Milliken. But it gives an overview, a snapshot. It maybe doesn't go into the actual stories that we're talking about or what you're presenting here today. And peace development and community relations and good relations have all kind of developed under different guises at different times, so we hear different terminologies. Community relations, EMU back in the past, EDI, CRED, shared education, all these types of terminologies, all kind of similar-esque, but sometimes it leaves the sector in a bit of confusion about who or what they are, and particularly as a peace builder, what does that actually mean? I think you're really, again, really important what you said, Emily, about strengthening the voice of our sector. So how do we tell that story? You know, do we really know what works? Do we really know what the actual work at community level and local level actually looks like or feels like? You know, I'm particularly interested in what's that hook to engage people in peace building work, which can be quite off-putting, particularly to young people who are like, what? We're jumping on this peace train, all peace and love, a bit like my little doves today on my shirt. You know, but being serious, it's like, what is this piece? What is it we're talking about? You know, how can we encourage and attract and incite young people to be part of these movements, and that they are leaders and inspiring other young people as change agents as well? So how do we strengthen that voice and create an appetite for this work? Sometimes I'm not sure if it's people are in it just for the job. It's a job, it's employment. You know, is it an inherent desire to be part of a peace building movement and to be allies to sort of grow and nurture the seeds that are required for peace building in this part of the world? Again, Emily, those things you talk about, you know, having the technique and the skill, the vision and the strategy, and really linking that at local level. I'm always really interested in, for young youth workers in particular, and volunteers who often do a lot of this work, they often do like to have a tool or a technique in their local community to help them or to aid them in terms of a curriculum resource. So sometimes we just jump onto creating new resources, and sometimes I feel we need to go back to some resources that are, you know, well evidenced and stood the test of time. And those resources can be local resources, or Council of Europe, for example, which would be pretty much my go-to in a lot of these places. But those resources inspire the local youth worker, or the regional youth worker for that matter, to kind of give them ideas about that they can intervene in their practice. The last 2 points really just in response, it's kind of this idea about who's dictating the script at local level. And you know, you spoke to McGinty there, Emily, which is great. And, you know, and these relationships should be horizontal, not vertical, and certainly not imposed youth work, imposed methodologies to peace building coming from up here or coming from outside here. It should be something that's negotiated in a horizontal manner, would be what I would say. In terms of your epic failure, Emily, I think, first of all, that's so honest of you to talk about like that. But again, it's about how you've used that experience in the North Belfast school. But it really did, again, land with me that, you know, sometimes we need to know how to facilitate difficult dialogue. You know, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's not just something we're born with. We learn it, and it's the place in which we learn it and can reflect on it. You know, to have difficult conversations and deal with sensitive issues. So, Emily, there are a few points just resonated with me from what you said today, and I don't expect you to necessarily respond to all of them, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was really helpful. I think I'm really caught by the whole question of how we create spaces and places for listening across, and that's certainly something that definitely resonates for me in Emily's work. So perhaps these are some of the things that we can come back to, and Emily will come back with a wee bit of a response to that once we go through the whole panel. But thanks very much for your input. Great to have you with us, inspiring change makers all as you go. Our second response today comes from Dr. Avila Kilmurray. So you're very welcome. It's great to see you. Avila has worked extensively in the community and voluntary sectors in Northern Ireland since 1975, and she was the director of the Community Foundation from 1994 to 2014. She's currently working for Social Change Initiative and maintains an extensive involvement in peace building through that work and through board commitments. Avila authored Community Development in a Contested Society, The Story of Northern Ireland. And Avila, we would be very grateful if you'd be able to respond to what you've heard from Emily's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shona, and thank you for the invitation. And to echo Martin's congratulations, Emily, for successfully knocking off the PhD and the book. And I must say, I take off my hat to you for coming to Northern Ireland in 1992. It was a miserable period, so it was at the time. And yet, within 2 years, we actually had the ceasefires. But I'm actually convinced that living through a period of violent conflict gives valuable insights into conflict transformation and peace building. It helps people, I think, to challenge the absolutes and the demands for ideal outcomes. And it allows us to see the sort of the greys and to accept nuance, as well as identifying niches to move things forward. And I actually think that for practitioners, it actually creates a context of marked contrast to very often the sort of the absolutism we can get from academia, which, you know, is looking for certainty in some of its concepts. And you mentioned, Emily, the sort of the natural know-how, which I think is so really important. And you kindly mentioned my book. And to be honest, I did that because so many practitioners were retiring or dying, and their stories literally were not being told. But I think that looking at those successful activists, sometimes I apply Lederer's three-level triangle model to politics as well as peace building. The micro-politics within and between communities, that grassroots level, the meso-level politics at institutional and organizational level, so often linked actually with gatekeeping, sometimes gate opening, but often gatekeeping. And then the macro politics of formal politics, electoral politics, and the linkages between these that are often unacknowledged. And I think that for practitioners, successful practitioners, this understanding of politics was an important part of the natural know-how. And indeed, actually, during the conflict, was an important toolkit in terms of just physical survival. And I think, as you mentioned, two other elements of natural knowledge is being able, as you say, to build and maintain relationships. And I see that in two ways, looking back. The ability to triangulate relationships, that you know that you're taking views and understanding from a range of different perspectives, but also what Professor Kieran McAvoy termed using insider-outsiders, those individuals who knew what were going on, perhaps within a non-state armed group or within a political party, but weren't necessarily under their discipline. Really important. And then, as I say, this impacted on the second element that you mentioned, the gauging, timing and pacing, as well actually as knowing when to button your lip, not to actually say something and certainly not to condemn. The term Phenesis is new to me, despite having many, many years ago studied political philosophy. I'm afraid I'm of an era that's more familiar with terms like praxis and hegemony, or the Ulster Scot tranness, just sticking at it. But I do think, as you say, it's a useful concept, although perhaps a wee bit off-putting in terms of terminology. And sometimes one of my critiques of academia is the tendency to use words that the ordinary 5/8 actually can't understand. So I always fall back on Ockram's precept of using terminology, the simpler the better. However, notwithstanding this, I do think that academic frames and reflection can be extremely useful, particularly where time is taken to share them with the curators of the essential grounded knowledge. And the people that are facing the quandary of what do I do on a Monday morning when paramilitary flags go up outside my community centre. But I think theory has to be almost like a mounting block rather than a cage in terms of actually enabling people to move forward. However, you know, I mean, I remember when Jean-Paul Lederer came first, and actually his overworked triangle of peace building really helped practitioners make sense of what was going on. And I'm always reminded, there was a study done of Holocaust survivors. They said those were the people that actually were best able to establish small areas where they felt of understanding and control. It gave them a framing to actually to move forward. I also think that actually the academic inquiry into concepts can be very important. And you know, I do some work with the Dahlia Association, which is a small community-based funder in Palestine, and they won't use the concept of peace building because of the inequities of power in that part of the world, but they will subscribe to conflict transformation. So again, the useful sort of use of terminology can actually liberate people to think in different ways. And my final plea is, don't let heavy academic peer review, which from the academic perspective is so pervasive, don't ever let that eliminate the what if factor. Martin Luther King didn't say he had a theory. He didn't say he had a concept. He didn't say he suffered from a nightmare. He said he had a dream. So thank you and good luck with the book.
I've just had something come up on my So thank you so much, Philip. That was amazing and very helpful just to think about it in terms of that kind of dream piece, that really beginning to dream that bigger. And I think I was really taken by the whole question of the niches that allow us to move forward, you know, that people spot the bits that's missing. And I think Emily was referring to that a bit in her when she was responding to the whole question of these different ways of looking at knowledge and learning. So it's really, really interesting for me. Thank you. Emily is going to come back to you very shortly with a bit of a response, but we really appreciate your input. Our final panellist this afternoon is Professor Brandon Hamber. And Professor Hamber is the John Hume and Thomas P. O'Neill Chair in Peace in INCORE. Brandon trained as a clinical psychologist in South Africa, and hopefully you can see the mixture of practitioner and researcher and policy that's going on in this space as well. He's gone on to undertake consulting and research work and participated in peace initiatives throughout the world. So a real international flavour there as well. An eminent scholar in his field, we are grateful to have him here this evening. And I know that Emily was really grateful for his guidance throughout her research with the team who she worked under for her PhD. Brandon, we'd be very grateful if you'd be able to respond to what you've heard of Emily's presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you for the invitation and opportunity to respond to this important book. And like everyone else, just congratulations again, Emily, on the PhD and on the book. And it's really sad that we're not sitting having a glass of wine and celebrating this incredible achievement. But at the same time, you know, I don't know if we would have had nearly 70 or 80 people at the launch. And so it's great to have the audience we have. And just looking at some of the names, there's some people I know from various countries as well. And so it's fantastic. So just congratulations. And I'm sure we'll get the chance to have the bottle of wine. And I suppose most importantly, congratulations on really developing the idea. I mean, you know, when you first came to us as the research team, it was an embryonic idea, as you explained, and you've just developed it so beautifully and practically and importantly. And so, you know, I think that's a really significant contribution, and the value of practical wisdom is something we really do need to take very seriously. And in the sort of academic field, as you know, there's, you know, this talk about the local turn in peace building and the appreciation of the local. And weirdly, sometimes people who even use that phrase are actually using it in a very academic way. And I think what your work has done is gives that local turn some form of life. So I wanted to really just make 3 points. And the first one is really, I mean, they're all really linked to the book in different ways. But the first is really central to what you talk about, which is really about what do we value and how do we value it. And I decided in preparation for this just to sort of Google United Nations local knowledge. And so I Googled that. And what was actually interesting, that what came up was really the emphasis of parts of UNESCO, particularly on the importance of using indigenous knowledge. Now, they obviously meant that for indigenous communities and groups whose lives have been decimated through colonization, and, you know, knowledge about local farming and so on and so forth has been lost. But there's a little paragraph that was written under this topic, which I just wanted to read out. And it said, local and indigenous knowledge refers to understanding, skills, and philosophies developed by societies with long histories of interaction with their natural surroundings. For rural and indigenous peoples, local knowledge informs decision-making about the fundamental aspects of day-to-day life and provide a foundation for locally appropriate sustainable development. Now, I wouldn't want to make a false parallel between the Northern Ireland peace sector and, you know, indigenous communities who, as I've said, have been decimated by colonization. But so much that was in that, I sort of felt applies to what you were talking about. You know, the long histories, what they said in that paragraph, the long histories of interaction with natural surroundings, and the long histories of people's interaction with the conflict here, in the same way as Avila mentioned it, has fundamentally created knowledge. It has to have created knowledge. Of course, we can't romanticize it, and we know conflict also creates negative patterns of behavior, but people have learned about their environment. And like that paragraph, this has fundamental aspects that influence day-to-day life. Whether that's the route that somebody takes because they're trying to avoid a conflict, or the way that you softly engage with somebody who you know is of a different political position. And so I guess the first point I really just wanted to make was the point you make in your book, which is there is so much of this indigenous knowledge that is valuable. And I think that we have to spend a lot more time celebrating and looking for it rather than dismissing it, which is really my second point. And that rather startling point you make in the book about, and that you made in your presentation, that many people will talk about the contribution of civil society as somewhere being insignificant in the peace process, which frankly is a bit of a joke, really, because I think, from my work here, that's really selling a massive contribution short. And I was thinking, what's an example of that? Well, one example of that is the state of the peace process at the moment. And one of the reasons why the peace process moved forward in 1998 was because the knowledge that people had gained about the importance of building relationship, of connecting people, as being a fundamental stepping stone to building the peace, was built into the peace process. We took politicians to South Africa, to other parts of the world. They tried to build relationships between people, to get them in the most basic way to almost know each other as a foundation to the peace process. Then what did we do? The moment we had peace, we stepped back. As long as they're working together, as long as they're doing this technical stuff of government, working on bread and butter issues will follow. And what followed was a steady degeneration of trust rather than building. And if you thought of that through a lens as a local peace builder, you would have gone on to keep building those relationships. And we didn't really do that. So I think even at the highest level, this type of practice is always there and really important. The third and final point I wanted to make links again to what you said, which was really about the way many of the people you spoke with talked about the challenge of, say, working in this technocratic peace environment, to the way in which they're pushed more and more towards professionalization. And that's the point I really wanted to throw out for people to maybe talk about today, which is, one of the points, which is how do we create an environment for learning? And if I think about the peace sector, and you raise these points, we know that it's dominated by funders. We know that funders are often dictating the agendas, that organizations that are funded have to collude with writing reports about things that maybe they didn't fully do because it fits the agenda of the funder, rather than talking about all the other extra additional stuff they've been doing at local level. And so they're hamstrung by this drive towards professionalism. And in the same way at the university, we're stuck in this technocratic management culture, where actually the idea of building a community partnership over a number of years and building a localized impact runs exactly in the opposite direction of all the bean counters who are counting students and how many research outputs you have to produce over a period of time. So we're all sort of tied into these systems that in a way work in the opposite direction of all of the wonderful, brilliant stuff that you have articulated. And so for me, when I was looking at the PhD again and thinking about this, that was the question that came to my mind, which is how do we actually create, as I said, this environment of learning and challenge the process, often embodied in these, for want of a better word, neoliberal institutions that so many of us find ourselves, that are often pushing in the opposite direction of what you have found to be so important. So to summarize that, how do we build on existing resources rather than importing them from the outside? How do we give processes time when we're in institutions that keep telling us there's no time? How do we, create genuine relationships as the cornerstone of growth, rather than seeing relationships as the cornerstone of profit, which is essentially, if I think of the university, that's how you end up seeing students, the cornerstone of profit, rather than that relationship and that investment is an investment that goes on for a lifetime, as it, will with you and your work. How do we focus on quality rather than quantity? How do we move towards being value-centered institutions rather than just being value-driven? How do we build expertise together you know, if I think of academia, all this push for you to like have your name on publications when actually they're co-produced with so many different people. How can we push back against that? And how do we, you know, push back against sort of professionalizing and rather looking at how are people proficient in what they actually do. So I hope that just gives a little bit of a flavor of just going back and looking at it again. That was the thought that came to me this morning, was sort of how do we embody that environment that you want us to really work with, so that we can really flourish in sort of developing that practical wisdom that you spoke about. So thanks again, Emily, and thank you for all those brilliant thoughts and for a fantastic piece of work. And I hope everyone will read the book, and it'll help us all to really change our practice in a really real way. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you so much for your input, really calling us into thinking about impact on policy, and impact and influence on policy as well. I think that's significant, and I see that being spoken to in the questions in the chat as well. So that question of how this can influence in terms of what we really know about quality activity, in terms of research, time and pace, relationships, really important stuff. So I'd really like to thank our panel first and foremost. That was very helpful and has thrown up some really interesting dilemmas, questions, challenges, hopeful and possibilities as well. So Emily, I'm going to turn to you, and given your extensive thinking on this, I wonder if you'd like to make a response to the panel.
Thank you, Shona. Thank you, Shona. And thank you, panel, for your insightful comments. I'm sort of a little bit dumbstruck in the sense of how much you've been able to kind of pull together and think through very different ways in which we could take this forward. And I suppose that is the challenge. I suppose as I'm listening to you and taking notes from your different responses, things that struck me in listening. I'll just say a little bit from each person. Martin, I think one of the things that really came strong in terms of thinking about what your input was about creating those spaces to listen, and particularly thinking about young people, and are we creating the spaces where we're passing on the knowledge of peace building to those young people, where we're building the experiences where they would be perhaps interested to get involved in peace building, and whilst there is a increasingly professionals peace building, can we kind of hope to inspire that they will be in it for vocational reasons, and I think it's a tricky one, and I suppose it is a question about being able to interrogate the kind of peace that we have now, and that again sort of dovetails into some of the other comments that the other panelists made. So maybe I'll just use that as a segue to think about Avila. So much of what you said, Avila, rung true for me in terms of, and this ties into the previous point. So what kind of peace do we have now? Are we arrived at the place that we thought and had hoped we would be? So we are in a place where the absolutes and the certainties maybe haven't manifested themselves, that we are in the in-between, and we're in the process of peace, and it's still unfolding. But just the usefulness at creating spaces where we can all talk together, where we can all be on equal footing. And I think, certainly, as I've said, one of my hopes that the book would do is to try to open up those spaces, and maybe by even acknowledging the tensions at the outset, it serves as a platform for being able to address it. So again, just using that as a further opportunity to take it to Brandon's point about, how do we do this practically? How do we create mechanisms where we can do things differently? If we've named the tensions, if we've named that a push towards a technocratic peace or overly bureaucratic peace building eliminates that space for these kind of knowledges to work well together, or have the place and space to reflect and learn from each other. How do we do that practically? I think there are practical opportunities that we can take. I think acknowledging, as I said, is the first place to do that. I think maybe committing to resisting a bit some of the trends, and also maybe being able to articulate why they're not helpful for us, and doing that in collaboration with each other, staying in relationship. again, thinking back on something Avila said about theory itself could be a mounting block rather than a cave. And so I think the things that, potentially we can learn from each other has the potential to move us forward as that mounting block would do. And I think that I think the fact that we're all in the room together today shows a commitment that can be made. And I think it is going to be a case of looking for avenues to try to resist the things that push us apart from each other, and to valuing these types of knowledge as all having something to contribute to the other. So I think those are all kind of instinctual responses that I have based on what you said. There's so much more that you said that I can't really do it justice. But maybe that will come out in some of the questions that have come up from the audience, and also that are some pre-discussion points that we talked about, Shona, as dovetailing into many of these ideas, like how do we create good reflective practice for practitioners? How do we create spaces where these types of knowledges are, confident enough to articulate for themselves? What can we learn together? And forge real relationships, meaningful relationships together. So maybe if you're okay, Shona, I will pass it back to you, and we'll take it back to the panel and take it back to some of the audience members.
Absolutely. Thank you, Emily. There's so much richness. It's hard to know where to start, isn't it? Maybe we will need 4 hours after all. But I think one of the questions that I feel is arising a little, there's a couple of different directions we could go, but I think I'll start with, the book argues that practical wisdom has been learned from earlier generations of peacebuilders. So there's a question of this information being passed between generations, if you like. And I guess that Martin spoke into that, but also in terms of policy, I think the rest of the panel spoke into that as well. So it's been learned from earlier generations of peace building about addressing conflict and building peace at local level. But are we passing along that learning to the next generation, or are we missing an opportunity to do that? Because certainly the funding patterns that Brandon, I think, is alluding to would suggest that we're always having to come up with a new idea or a new creation possibility. And so that deep wisdom, which has been carried by those who are participating in the work of good conflict management, might be lost. So there's a question underpinning that around practical wisdom and generational, the carriage of that generationally. Would anyone like to speak into that? Martin, we'll start with you.
Okay, I've just moved house there, quite literally. Young people have come into the building, so quite rightly so, they're occupying the space I was in. But yeah, I think really for me in this one, I'm thinking about the sociological term of Anthony Giddens here, like runaway world. And often we talk about the patience of peace in a runaway world. So when I think about this question, are we listening and learning from practitioners, Shona, it really gets me to thinking about, do we create that space? Do we have space for reflection where we purposefully pause? We embed critical reflective practice, where we actually think about the stories. When I think about youth workers out doing their job, and we talk about needs assessment as well and what's going on in communities, it's not a one-off tick box exercise. It's like reconnaissance of you're observing and noticing and listening as you go through your journey in terms of youth work and peace building in local contexts. So, that process of listening and learning is quite complex, I think. But then we have the responsibility to lead. And as Avila said, a lot of us are moving on now in our careers. Some people are dying, of course, some people are here and retiring or whatever, but we have a responsibility to lead. And I feel it as a peace builder on my shoulders as well, to help communicate that story and to build a new story, like our story in the making, as we say right now in terms of the centenary, for example. But what is the story of peace building, for example, through youth work, and how do we best tell that? For me, it's about volunteers are mostly doing this work in local communities. So it's how do we connect them in and help them to hear one another's stories and that they can learn from one another, not just in this country, but from other countries as well. And, I would be the first to be very frustrated at all those little jollies of people going off around different parts of Europe and beyond, to spaces of contested spaces and come back and nothing happens. They really go to... Sorry, Shona.
I think you're a little glitchy there. I'm just, I'm gonna, yes, I'm going to just, yes, that would be great. And I'm going to just move that on to Avila. Sorry about that. It just was a wee tiny bit glitch, so hard for people to maybe keep going with it. For me, it's there's some very significant thinking about there in terms of how we create space. And I love the concept of the international Phenesis as well. Who else is out there with the stories and learning and practical wisdom? Avila, I'm going to come to you.
Yes, I mean, I think the issue of creating space for reflection is really important. And I mean, we are always, you know, there's this sense of busyness around that people actually find it hard to actually get the space if they are practitioners. But just the point I would also like to make is, you know, do we actually have hierarchies of those whose practical wisdom is acceptable? Because one of the experiences I had when I was working in the Community Foundation was working with political ex-prisoners from 5 different paramilitary backgrounds. And we actually had a sort of a 4-year project in cooperation actually with academics in Queen's University of turning their experience into curriculum material, the From Prison to Peace pack, which was duly launched by the then Minister for Education. People from both Republican and Loyalists went in pairs into schools to talk to young people about the importance of the peace process and not getting involved in violence. And then it just disappeared because actually that constituency was not regarded as acceptable. So I think we have, you know, hierarchies of acceptability in terms of the practical wisdom. And I think we're losing out a lot by actually not challenging.
Perfect. So, I mean, who's at the table becomes absolutely key in terms of the sharing. And I suppose the Venn diagram, I'm reminded of that. Who do we need to bring to the table in order for that Venn diagram to be as rich as possible? Thank you, Avila. Brandon, I think you would like to come in on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe add another point to it, which is, you know, this idea of sort of passing knowledge on can also have an element of it where it sort of feels a little bit patronizing or sort of top down as well. So, you know, how do we create those spaces where that's a sort of a two-way street? You know, I grew up in South Africa, you know, through the 80s and 90s. So what I think of as community organizing has a very specific type of bent to it. What the average 15-year-old thinks is community organizing today is quite different, and they can probably teach me quite a lot about how to do that differently. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to throw that in terms of how do we sort of develop the sort of mutual types of learning spaces, and not sort of it's a different hierarchy to what Avila was talking about, but set up another type of a hierarchy. You know, and I see it all the time, you know, where, you know, if I think of somewhere like South Africa, you know, with some of the student protests that took place a few years ago, and a lot of people from my generation who would have supported instinctually those protests, sort of then responding really negative because they sort of weren't done in the way that they would have done them ideologically, you know, instead of saying, actually, what do we mutually learn about how we might do this differently? And there are things that I know and people can learn from, but there are things that I also don't know in terms of how, say, different people are negotiating the world today.
Thank you. I think that really, for me, reminds me a little bit of some of the rivalry that goes on around wisdom as well. And again, it's back to that, how do we create that real space for listening? And so people can recognise when practice is impactful, I suppose, and where we can learn from that as opposed to maybe rival with it. And that is difficult with big funding structures in place, I think, which put pressure on who speaks. Emily, would you like to respond into that question?
I think that it is a tricky one, and I think that it's important to name that those tensions exist. And you're right, Brandon. You know, my 16-year-old, you know, has a very different sense of knowledge than I do, and what I need to know. He would have a very different perspective on what is important for me to know about social change going forward, which is right. It's absolutely right. I suppose the tension is not always to move on to the new shiny bright thing when there's plenty of things that need to be revisited. And I suppose, you know, when we were preparing for this, it did make me think about of some of the resources and some of the conceptual frameworks that were really, really helpful at different points. So it's a case of like, how do you go forward and get people excited and want to be committed to building, continuing to be part of peace building processes, which has to be ongoing and has to be something we continue to pay attention to, but also don't lose that knowledge and wisdom that came before, and all those good resources, all those good ideas. How can we continue to build upon them? I mean, thinking even about the work that you did, Brandon, with Grania and the reconciliation definition, and how important that was, and how good a theory that is, and the 5 strands. And I think, why aren't we still talking about that? That's really a helpful framework. So I guess it is that tension, and it's a tricky one. I don't know if I have any easy answers to it, but I think it's difficult.
Great. I think there's real questions in how we keep good practice and good resources and maintain that within our work. And I do think that's a good question to call ourselves into, because some of the practical wisdom, I suppose, is already on paper. And I suppose Avla's experience of Prison to Peace is very much an example of that. So there's good stuff. How do we make sure that we keep bringing it to the surface and revisiting it, but also how do we ensure that it doesn't become a hierarchy of what's right and what's not? So some big storylines in there. Do you have any experiences or thoughts and views of positive experience of collaboration you've seen between these knowledges, between Phenesis, techne and episteme, between academics, politicians and policymakers? Do people have any very specific examples they would like to throw in on that, or anything that they've seen which has been very useful? Anybody like to speak into that? I've got Avla first and then Martin.
Yes, I mean, and I'm really sort of going back in time now a bit, but actually one of my experiences that I think was one of the most positive examples was back in the late 1980s, when a civil servant, which would have been in fact a couple of civil servants with a bit of foresight, actually got together a grouping of practitioners, academics, policymakers, to actually model the Community Relations Council. And we did it through a whole series of meetings over probably about an 18-month period. And it was actually drawing from, but it was, we were meeting with an intention, was there. But it actually worked really well because there was an equitable balance of respect between the various inputs. It wasn't that there was an academic paper commissioned and then practitioners were marched in to comment on it. It actually was through dialogue and through the sharing of ideas. So, and I think we perhaps lost that way of actually making policy a bit. But certainly for me, that was a really worthwhile experience.
Fantastic, thank you. I think that's very impressive, and those kind of opportunities of connecting in, because also I think, speaking probably more as a practitioner, that there is sometimes an anxiety about stepping into that space and what that might feel like, and maybe vice versa. Those are the conversations to be had, but it's exciting. There are models, and we need to be aware of those. Martin.
Hopefully I'm coming across clear this time, Shona. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of youth work anyway, we don't necessarily see the academics as sitting up in an ivory tower or anything. They have came through the practice world. There are colleagues on here today that I've worked alongside in practice who have just taken a different step forward. So they're no better. They're they have a different job to do, but it's how we work together in terms of that horizontal relationship I was speaking to before. A great example at the moment is the Taking Boys Seriously 2 initiative with Ulster University that Emily was formerly part of, and Susan Morgan. Was a good balance of practice, academic, research type stuff, action research going on. Some challenges obviously around funding, but that's always an issue for the charity sector in terms of how we do that. I can think of other examples as well where we have a peace activism through youth work community of practice group where people come together, not through funding. It's not a partnership. It's just a group of allies, of committed people to come together to talk about peace building and youth work. And they are academics. their policy people, their researchers, their youth workers, their managers. So that really incites hope for me, that people are talking and working together, that they come together through critical youth research hubs, that come together through critical thinking to explore models. It's this ongoing interaction between theory and practice and policy. One just at the moment as well with the University of Glasgow and Dr. Sinead Gormley. You know, we've been talking with Sinead for a while now about doing exactly what you have done, Emily, but on a slightly different approach. It's lessons from grassroots practices across Northern Ireland in terms of peace building, but also Afghanistan, Mexico, the US border as well. So that's an initiative we're hoping will be funded by Bright Space and the Spencer Foundation. So again, but it's about talking with each other and really listening, but it's about the relationships we have with each other that makes it work. On occasions, an academic has came my way and they've been an unknown entity to me, and that's when the problems start. There isn't maybe that trusted relationship. So in itself, it's almost like peace building. It's based on the relationship.
Martin, that's very... I'm caught by the idea of how we ensure that we know what else is going on as well. How do we get that information out? Because there's a lot of good activities happening, and activity definitely in this field, but maybe not the connections between it. So that's very, just brings to me some ideas about how we make connections on those things, and that is mainly through relationship. I'm caught by the time, as always, as we always are, but I am looking at some of the questions that are in the chat function. And some very interesting questions. Hopefully some of the panel have touched on some of that and some of those thinking and questions. We will not get through them all today, but I'm going to start. There was one early on in the thread from Derek, which was, I think, a little bit about risk and what practices and policy need to be in place to allow people to take risks for peace. So sometimes I think there's a sense that that practices and policies mitigate that risk. What could we be doing differently to allow people to try and use their practical wisdom or to develop that? I wonder if anybody in the panel, if Emily or any of the others would like to speak into that. Emily, I'll let you go first.
I'm just pleased I figured out how to do that reaction function and raise my hand. I think it's a great question, and I do think there's some good examples of that. I remember discussions about CRC being able to have a Pathfinders fund. For example, the Community Relations Council for some time had I think it was called Pathfinders, and it was set up for exactly that reason, so that there could be a bit of risk taking, a bit of innovation that could be funded. I think the sort of paradigm of experimenting a bit is maybe a helpful paradigm for some of our work to be thinking about, that we don't have to have it all mapped out ahead of time. And I think sometimes it's difficult when you're applying for funding. You feel like you have to promise that you're going to have X, Y, and Z done, and it's going to be done in a certain amount of time frame. It's going to involve a certain amount of people, and it's going to have, all these outcomes that are already set out. And I think that element of risk then is taken away because you feel like you have to be promising the world. But I think supporting the risk is really important. So I do think there have been examples where that's worked really well. And I think where it's certainly, and from a practitioner's perspective, where funders can be flexible and build that kind of risk into the funding, that's really helpful for those of us who are in practice, because we then feel like we can be in good relationship with our funders and express, hey, that didn't work out. We thought this was going to work in a particular way and it didn't, or a community dispute erupted and we couldn't run things the way we thought. So we had to mothball the whole thing for 6 months. So I think that's right. I think risk is important. I think we need to build more opportunities for that flexibility. That's just sort of some initial responses.
I'm going to bring in, thank you for that. And I'm going to bring in, Brandon, had your hand up and then down again. Is it up?
Well, no, I was pretty much going to say what Emily said about the importance of funding risk, and so I decided to take my hand down, and I see Avala's next, and
perfect.
Certainly in her work as a funder, they funded lots of risk. So I think we can hear from Avala, but yeah, I think that ethos has disappeared certainly in the last 5 to 10 years here compared to when I first came here in 1996, and certain funders who were prepared to completely fund things that might go belly up, and I think that that's disappeared with our overstating it, but yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Pavla.
Okay, just on risk, I always called when we were using the European Union money, you know, when you had to sort of have, you say things were going to be sustainable after 2 years or whatever else. I used to always say we're engaged in a minuet of mutual deception. I would ask the group, is this going to be the case? They'll say yes, and then I would say to the EU, oh yes, definitely. And we all knew there wasn't a hope in hell about it actually happening. You know, but the other aspects of risk, I think, are well, two things actually. Going back to Roger McGinty's, you know, critique of the liberal peace scenario, there is a danger, I think, that, you know, people involved in peace building, and Emily's touched on this, you know, are more in the fix-it category than in the pioneer research and development category. And I think, you know, we need to get back to the research and development category. And for that also, I think it's really important to have good members of boards and management committees, you know, in terms of giving people cover to actually take the risk. And indeed, I think, you know, mentoring and quite often I don't see mentoring as a formal thing, but more of an informal, that they, you know, people can have a little support group. And the last thing I'd say to actually sort of, I suppose, mitigate the sort of the burden of risk is, and I think we've lost it a bit, is just a sense of fun. I mean, I spent part of this morning having coffee with Jackie Redpath and Sammy Douglas. And I mean, them talking about, you know, what they were getting up to as community workers at different points. I mean, it was just hilarious, basically. But actually, there was that almost sense of fun. And it was quite interesting because I was in a webinar last week, and somebody was talking about that, about actually in terms of mobilizing people. And we can see it in the Occupy movement or Extinction Rebellion, almost that sense of, you know, young people actually wanting to enjoy the protest, not spending, you know, 6 hours working out tactics and strategy. And the fact that, you know, empathy is the thing that keeps people involved and keeps people engaged, rather necessarily than having, you know, a 100-page tract about what they should be doing.
Yeah, it makes me laugh to think about, you know, because it does get serious with the outputs and outcomes and jump over this and fill out that and stand in your head. And there is something lovely about really just getting around the idea and really thinking about what might make a difference or what might change possibilities and having those conversations with different kinds of people. So yeah, very helpful. I'm conscious Lisa wants to come into the conversation. Lisa, you would like to make a comment?
Yeah, just very briefly, Shona. So just from the angle of, you know, been an NGO in the sector and been around for almost, well, not me, been around for 40 years in the sector. That'd be a bit ridiculous to be on the Botox day and night at that rate. But, you know, just to say that we've had a really, really positive experience over particularly this last 10 years with our relationship with funders. So some of our funders are incredibly flexible. They trust our approach. We have nuanced conversation with them in between application and, you know, post-evaluation. And I think sometimes it's how you use the different type of sort of funding parameters. So some funding is very tightly bound and more project orientated. That's fine if you, in a sense, use those project funds as part of your longer process. If you attach to a locality or a community or a number of communities, you can see a sustainable sort of process over 5, 10, 15 years plus. And if the work develops and gallops and sort of more players are brought in because they can see your intentional and committed you know, position in that community and constantly widening out the parameters for other players to come in, community, statutory, individuals, whatever. So I think you can develop a process which takes account of funders who are more flexible. Like for us, the Community Relations Council have been incredible over the last several years, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And where there, as I say, there's more like a tightness around project, or dare I say, butts on seats. Not that we shy away from that whatsoever, but what we found, you know, CRIS would never have been able to trial and innovate and then, I suppose, learn to how to articulate our practice through, you know, a model, for example, and then test that and attempt to scale that if it wasn't for the trust and the flexibility of the donors that we've had to date. So that's all I wanted to say. Maybe it's a unique experience or not so common, but certainly we've been quite blessed with that relationship.
I think that's really hopeful, actually. And I think that is back to that question of how we engage those relationships, ensure that those conversations between the three knowledges are happening. And so we're constantly regarding opportunities for relationship, engagement, communication, all of those things come to the fore. So thanks for that, Lisa. Oh, listen, time is flying, folks, flying, it always flies. But I want to just tuck in one little question Rob or Michael had brought earlier on, which is just any reflections on engaging international Phenesis as well, and bringing in that. And I suppose we have heard a bit of that in the room, but just he was asking about ensuring that we engage with different people's Phenesis from different places. Any thoughts on that before we close up for the afternoon?
Shona, maybe I have a few thoughts just thinking about the research again. So what was interesting, I suppose, is so in the literature, there's lots of discussion about insiders and outsiders, and whether or not, and I suppose my own research touched into whether or not tensions, whether if you're an outsider, you automatically don't have as much to offer to local peace building. And I suppose one of the things that was quite interesting in talking to the practitioners was that they did find that outsiders could be helpful at times, depending on the approach that was taken. So asking good questions and really letting the local practitioner lead the way was helpful, because it drew out knowledge and it drew out thinking that was held tacitly. So I think there's lots to be learned from international exchanges and experiences, and sometimes somebody who's coming in may see things in a different way, ask different sets of questions that haven't been asked yet, or that perhaps if you're from here, you think, oh, well, I can't ask those questions. Everyone knows I'm not supposed to ask those questions, where I think the international can sometimes ask the stupid question and have a conversation. So I suppose that maybe that doesn't exactly tie into Rob's point, but I do think it speaks to something about that local outsider role, maybe a wee bit more nuanced than sometimes the literature even kind of describes.
That's really helpful. It makes me laugh, actually, because I think that's been very useful for me. Being Scottish has allowed me to ask some very silly questions all the time. So thank you for that ratification. There's a flurry of hands up, and there's a million questions that could be asked, Emily, and that is only testament to your fantastic research and your book. And there is excitement about that, and maybe opportunities ahead for further conversation. But sadly, time has caught up with us, and it falls to me to bring us to a conclusion. The discussion has been so rich. I hope you'll agree. And I suppose I'm really struck by the idea of this three-way street, if you like, this three different knowledges which we are trying to make connections between, whether it be policy, whether it be something technical, something theoretical, or something practical. How do we bring those to the table and really deeply learn about that? How do we bring some of the learning from before forward and make that useful and make that reflective? I'd like to also say I really was excited by the conversation about experimentation and the room for sharing and reflection. And I think there's a real thirst for that, actually, and a beginning to be an interest where people may have been nervous of that before. So, Emily, you have completely inspired us all with your thinking. I'd like to thank all of our panellists. Martin, Brandon and Avila really brought insightful and significant and thoughtful responses to the table. And it's always exciting to hear what becomes important in a conversation. I'd like to also thank all of the people in the room. And I do apologise if your question wasn't answered or wasn't tapped on. There's still opportunities, and Emily is still nearby for conversations. But we're grateful that you came today, and we appreciate that. I'd like to thank all the partners, Community Relations in Schools, INCORE and Corrymeela. And even though we've not been in the same room, we've been in the same place. And I think the learning has been rich. Thanks to Gareth and Nadine for valiantly managing the IT, which is always an adventure, and to Lisa for introducing us this afternoon. And I think I would like to most importantly say that I'd really like to thank Emily for providing us with such a rich food for thought. And she's asked us to consider the question, how do we create an environment where episteme, techne and Phenesis can all flourish together. And I hope that this stays with you as you leave this evening. If we're only working with one or two of these knowledges, then potentially we are missing a vital opportunity, and our peace building could suffer as a result of that. Surely our peace is really too important to leave any of those behind. So I want to commend to you her new book, Theorising Civil Society and Peacebuilding, which is now available in all excellent stores and online. And we're grateful that you've come together with us on this International Day of Peace and as part of the Good Relations Week. And we appreciate the spirit of cooperation and collaboration which we've seen today. I'm going to suggest that in order to come to a conclusion, that we might unmute our computers at this point and close the evening with a big round of applause for Emily. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Much appreciated. Go safely. Goodbye and good evening.
Thank you.